Welcome all to this Zoom presentation on notable women in Hancock history by John Haeussler. This event is co-sponsored by the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw and riseUP, recognizing the importance of women's suffrage everywhere, UP or Upper Peninsula. I'm Faith Morrison, I'm from riseUP, and I'll serve as your moderator this evening. Just technical details, we're doing this on Zoom because of the coronavirus problem. It is being recorded and will be shared on the website of the Carnegie Museum once it's over. Due to reports that there can be some unpleasant takeover events in Zoom meetings, we got you all muted and we're taking those precautions, hopefully to just make this a really pleasant and successful evening. If you have questions, please feel free to write them into the chat at any time. If you have a concern if you have a question that you'd like answered right away, I've been given permission by John to use my judgment and perhaps allow that in the middle of the presentation as well. If it were live, we would probably be doing that. This is one of a series of local events that serve to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States, to commemorate the suffrage and acquisition of full citizenship rights by all populations, to highlight the civic and cultural contributions of women, and to encourage everyone to exercise the right to vote. So this fits right into that wheelhouse as highlighting the civic and cultural contributions of women. So now I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, local history enthusiast John Haeussler. John S. Haeussler is the author of the book Hancock by Arcadia Publishing, 2014, released in Arcadia's Images of America series. He previously co-authored and co-edited Hancock's sesquicentennial publication, Hidden Gems and Towering Tales, a Hancock, Michigan anthology, published by the City, 2013. John, a former mayor of Hancock, and his family have resided in the city since 2007. And I said his title already, Notable Women in Hancock History. And John, we welcome you and look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Faith. And let me start out with a few thank yous. Everyone joining us this evening, really appreciate you being here. As Faith mentioned, this was originally planned for the Carnegie Museum, but because we can't be there, smarter people than I put their heads together and realized that we could be here so we can enjoy each other's company with a little local history tonight via Zoom. I'd like to offer a thank you personally to Faith Morrison from riseUP for both moderating and recording the presentation, and to Elise Nelson, who's with us tonight from the Carnegie Museum. Of course, the Carnegie and riseUP are co-sponsors of tonight's presentation. So thank you to both Faith and Elise for putting this opportunity together. For those of you who've attended my presentations in the past, you know that I really like to banter with the audience and feed off the audience, and we tend to take tangents and go wherever they may lead. Tonight's presentation is going to be different in that I'm going to do primarily a straight run through of the presentation of the material, both verbally and visually. I personally am not following the chat function on Zoom, but Faith will be following it, and as she said, she can interrupt with questions, but there is going to be a Q&A session following the presentation tonight, and hopefully that will be dynamic as well. So among other things, because it's not as much give and take as usual, the presentation might not be as long as a lot of my presentations are, just because we're not going to be going off on a whole bunch of tangents, but I wanted to let people know that. There are going to be a lot of photos shown this evening. Some of the photos are better quality than others. I apologize in advance for that. I've attempted to get the best quality photos for each subject that I could and that fit with the material I wanted to present. So a few of them are pixelated, but most of them I think are going to come out really well. So why are we talking about notable women in Hancock history? Well, as Faith mentioned, even though this particular presentation doesn't focus on women's suffrage, this is the 100th anniversary year, and spotlighting women in history is an obvious cross-promotional opportunity. I'm personally a Hancock resident, and my local history interest is largely focused on my hometown of Hancock. Hence, the combination of women and Hancock just came together for Notable Women in Hancock History. And I'd like everyone to note that, please, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just going to be a snapshot of a few women through time. There are thousands upon thousands of laudable women in the history of Hancock, no doubt some of whom who have joined us this evening. And some of the women I'm going to focus on tonight will only be touched on very briefly. So the women I'm doing tonight, some will spend a few minutes with, some will just spend a couple minutes on. So getting into a little bit of the tie-in here, talking a little bit about the history of women's suffrage. In November of 1918, Michigan voters approved a state constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. And on January 27th, 1919, 4 Hancock women registered to vote. These are believed to be the first 4 female registered voters in the city of Hancock. They were Clara Hoffenbacher, Daisy Reed, Elsa Tolinen, and Jenny Storm. Clara Hoffenbacher was in fact the wife of the then city clerk. So I like to think that the city clerk was in favor of women's suffrage, and he was very happy that his wife was first in line to register to vote. Moving forward a little bit in the timeline, in June of 1919, Michigan ratified the 19th Amendment. It was one of the first 3 states to do so on that date, along with Illinois and Wisconsin. In February of 1920, just over 100 years ago, a couple months ago, the League of Women Voters was founded. And then coming up the 100th anniversary this summer, in August of 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, the number needed for it to become part of the US Constitution. And the 19th Amendment was officially adopted on August 26, 1920. And the group riseUP, recognizing the importance of women's suffrage everywhere, and the Keweenaw, the Upper Peninsula chapter, is who Faith is representing tonight and who is co-sponsoring this presentation. So let's get into the women of Hancock. I'd like to start with actually a group rather than an individual. And the group are the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. And believe it or not, the sisters pronounced it Carondelet. I've been saying Carondelet for years, but I'm trying to make a conscious effort to change that and do as the sisters say and say the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. Now, the Sisters of St. Joseph served in Hancock's parishes, St. Joseph's Hospital, and St. Joseph's School of Nursing for about 115 years. And I'd like to read, I'm not going to read much text tonight, but I'd like to read a little bit of text so people have some appreciation of these sisters who came here. This text was written by Hancock resident and my dear friend Corbin Eddy, and it's found in the city's sesquicentennial publication, Hidden Gems and Towering Tales. This is what Corbin Eddy has to say. In 1899, Frederick Ice, Bishop of Marquette, learned that the Sisters of St. Francis would be withdrawing from St. Mary's Hospital in Hancock, which they had founded just 3 years earlier in Bishop John Burton's family home. And as an aside, by the way, Bishop John Burton's family home, where the St. Mary's Hospital was, is on the block where the Holiday Station is now on Hancock Street. Sort of, kind of where the old Christian bookstore was, is roughly the location of that St. Mary's Hospital. The bishop contacted the Mother Superior of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in St. Louis, Missouri, with the hope that they would be able to take over a clearly difficult challenge in the far north. As Providence had it, there were nursing sisters who had just arrived back in New York after serving in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. They were sent to a very different island, the Keweenaw Peninsula. As the public and local physician gained confidence in the sisters, the hospital outgrew the Verton home, and a new St. Joseph's Hospital on Water Street was dedicated in 1904. The building was unique to the area. Designed in the style of a Renaissance chateau appropriate to the French roots of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Perched high above the canal, it featured formal entrances, ornate masonry, turrets, and gables. Its interior had paneled ceilings and carefully detailed oak window and door frames. Another war veteran, this time of World War I, Sister Irma Doherty, was sent to Hancock in 1920 to organize a school of nursing, which was accredited by the Michigan Board of Nursing in 1923. As the school and community continued to grow, a chapel was added to the hospital, and a nurse's residence was constructed in 1929 with funds donated by John D. Ryan. A new 9-story hospital was constructed in 1951, and with the completion of the new building, the entire old hospital was refurbished for the School of Nursing, and it was renamed Ryan Hall. The nurses' residence, which you can see on the screen right now, became the convent for the sisters. Sister John Kenneth Scott was named Directress of St. Joseph's School of Nursing in 1965. A strong advocate for community nursing education, she oversaw the program until its last commencement in 1974. The transition from sponsorship of the hospital by the sisters to a nonprofit corporation had already begun under the direction of Sister Jean Frances Hogue and was completed in 1976. And on the screen right now, you should be seeing a picture of Sister Jean Frances Hogue. She's at the hospital, I believe, reading the daily announcements. The hospital, after 1976, was completely under the direction of a board of lay trustees and administered by a contract management team based in Tennessee, and it was renamed Portage View Hospital. In the ensuing years, the 1929 nurses' residence that had become a convent was remodeled once again for medical offices. With the School of Nursing closed, Ryan Hall stood empty, and by 1985 it had deteriorated to such a point that the hospital board voted to demolish the structure for reasons of public safety. Portage View Hospital became Portage Health in 1995, and a completely new campus was opened on Quincy Hill in 2000. The 1951 hospital and the 1929 nurses' residence now comprise Finlandia University's Judula Center. So that's a little bit of history of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. Now, one of the remnants of the sisters' time in Hancock, and remember they spent over a century here, is Carondelet Park, which is near Elevation Street and Lake. And it's on private property, but with the permission of the property owners, it is maintained by a group of residents as a place of serenity in honor of those sisters who served in our community for over a century. And what you're seeing right now is the grotto of St. Joseph at Carondelet Park. This picture was taken about 5 years ago. And no, that is not St. Joseph in there. St. Joseph is no longer there in the grotto, but St. Francis is now a seasonal resident of the grotto. So I encourage anyone who hasn't seen it, it hasn't gotten its spring cleanup yet this year, but Carondelet Park is a beautiful place for serenity, honoring the sisters who served in this community for over a century. And this is a picture from several years ago of my young daughter giving a presentation to the Kiwanis Club there, seated in Carondelet Park. So the sisters served in the community of Hancock from about 1861 through 1976. Moving on, I'd like to next move to Reverend Mother Agnes Gonzaga Ryan. Reverend Mother was born Alice Ryan in 1855, and she was baptized by Bishop Barriga. She attended St. Anne's School in Hancock, and she almost certainly knew the sisters that you saw pictured earlier in the presentation. Those sisters were from St. Anne's School in about 1870. Sister Agnes Gonzaga Ryan entered the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. She spent time at Troy, Glens Falls, and Albany, New York, and also Denver, Colorado. And in those locations, she served as a teacher, a superintendent, and a principal. She moved to the Mother House in St. Louis in 1896 as a member of the General Council of the Order. She was elected Superior General of the congregation in 1905, and that position bestowed on her the title of Reverend Mother. Reverend Mother traveled to Rome. She met with Pope Pius X. She was present at the Vatican for the pronouncement of the beatification of Joan of Arc. She saw the need for additional education and training for her sisters, including new methods of teaching, nursing, and childcare. Now, Reverend Mother's dream was to sponsor a college for young women. They had a high school that was attached to the Mother House in St. Louis, but there was no continuing education for the young women and the sisters who were going into the fields of nursing and teaching and childcare. So Reverend Mother purchased property in St. Louis with the dreams of eventually erecting a college there. Unfortunately, she died before that dream became a reality. However, after World War I, Fontbonne University was established in St. Louis in 1923 on the property the sister purchased. Alice's brother, Hancock-born industrialist John D. Ryan, quietly contributed the funds to build the entire campus. As a tribute to his generosity, the administration building was to be named Ryan Hall, and what you're seeing on the screen right now is Ryan Hall at Fontbonne University in St. Louis. However, John D. insisted that the building not be named for him, but instead it honor his sister, Alice Ryan, Reverend Mother Agnes Gonzaga Ryan, whose dream for the continuing education of young women had been realized with the building of Fontbonne University. Fontbonne University became co-ed in the 1970s. Until this very day, Ryan Hall remains the center of its campus. So if you're ever in St. Louis, visit Fontbonne University and check out Ryan Hall. I know it's on my bucket list because, among other things, the school was founded by a Hancock-born family, and Ryan Hall is named for a Hancock-born individual. Moving on, next, we're going to go to Mary Chase Perry Stratton. And this is a picture of before she was married, when she was still Mary Chase Perry at Stable Studio in Detroit. Now, Mary Chase Perry was born in 1867 in Hancock at the Perry home at 222 Hancock Street. And anyone who's familiar with Hancock is probably familiar with the home. It was formerly known as the Pewabic House, and today it's known as the Celtic Quarter. Why was this particular property known as the Pewabic House? Well, because Mary Chase Perry, who this is the Perry family home, founded Pewabic Pottery, which is known for Pewabic Tile and much more, and which is still thriving today. Pewabic Pottery is still thriving today in the city of Detroit. Mary Chase Perry was just a brilliant ceramicist, and Pewabic Tile was an innovation in ceramics. And some of the Pewabic Tile installations in her lifetime included the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Detroit, which is what we're seeing right now, the Guardian Building in Detroit, which is called the 36-story Cathedral of Finance. This next picture is also in St. Paul. The Most Holy Redeemer Church in Detroit, and the picture on the screen now is some of the tile work at Most Holy Redeemer. Now, Most Holy Redeemer was once the largest Roman Catholic parish in all of North America, and it was the largest English-speaking parish in the entire world. Another one of Mary Chase Perry's installations in her lifetime was at the Detroit Public Library. And this is a fireplace at the Detroit Public Library, and you can see there's all kinds of different tile mosaic scenes all around. So if you're ever in Detroit, you really can't move around Detroit without seeing Pewabic tile somewhere in the city. In addition, during her lifetime, probably her biggest installation was at the Crypt Church in the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. And Mary Chase Perry Stratton worked on this particular installation for several years. And among other things, it includes in Pewabic tile all of the Stations of the Cross. Now, Mary Chase Perry Stratton died in 1961. She was born in 1867 and lived well into her 90s until 1961. But her company, Pewabic Tile, still exists today in Detroit. And several recent installations of Pewabic Tile just in the Detroit area include the stations of the Detroit People Mover, Comerica Park, which is pictured on the screen. That's Pewabic Tile outside of Comerica Park. And also the brand new Little Caesars Arena in Detroit, where the Red Wings play hockey. If you've ever been there, there's plenty of Pewabic Tile outside of the building there and on the building. There's just far too many notable installations of Pewabic Tile to discuss here. But if you're interested in this artwork, I highly suggest that you go online and search about Pewabic pottery and Pewabic tile. and a little bit more about Mary Chase Perry Stratton, our famous Hancock-born ceramicist. And Mary Chase Perry Stratton was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame in 1986. And this is a picture of her while she was living in Detroit, and was a, even in her lifetime, was a world famous ceramicist. Moving on from our Hall of Famer, next I'd like to talk a little bit about the Jennings Sisters. The Jennings Sisters, the older sister was named Mary, but everyone knew her as Minnie Jennings. She was born in 1865 in St. Agnes, Cornwall, England. She moved to Fayette, Wisconsin as a toddler. Her sister, much younger sister, about 17 years, Edith Jennings, was born in Wisconsin in 1882. Their fathers and brothers were farmers in that area. Now, the two Jennings sisters matriculated to Hancock early in the 20th century, and around 1905 they opened a millinery at 108 Quincy Street in Hancock, selling women's hats and related items. And the picture you can see on the screen is an interior view of the Jennings Sisters millinery shop on Quincy Street. And I'll move forward. We have one from a little bit later generation here as well. One thing I thought that was interesting about the Jennings Sisters is I looked up the 1920 Department of Labor statistics, employment statistics. The Jennings Sisters in the 1920 Department of Labor listings were said to have 3 employees, and all 3 of their employees were female. And contrast that to the largest employer in the area at the time was the Quincy Mining Company. In 1920, the Quincy Mining Company had 1,402 employees, of which 10 were women. Now, what I had hoped to tell you tonight with authority was that Jennings Street in Hancock is named for the Jennings Sisters. And I have dug into this in several different locations, and I haven't been able to tell you with authority, but I'm just going to say it almost has to be so. Jennings Street was so named sometime, it looks like, in the second half of the 1920s, and there were no one named Jennings living on the street at the time, and by far and away, the only prominent Jennings in Hancock were the Jennings Sisters, who by that time had been running their millinery shop for well over 2 decades and would have been very well known to everyone in the community. So if you're familiar with Jennings Street, I believe for certain that it was named after the Jennings Sisters. Now, anyone who's done a lot of research is probably familiar with Sanborn fire maps, but if you're not, the next image on the screen is a Sanborn fire map. This shot is from August of 1917. And what's really interesting about this Sanborn company, who did these fire maps for communities all over the United States, is that they show what each building was in the community, what it was used for, and what it was constructed of. And so we're looking at the 100 block of Quincy Street here. Here's Texcoco Street. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving on the screen. So here's Quincy Street. Here's 108 Quincy Street. This is where the Jennings had their millinery shop. Now, sometimes these buildings were small enough that you couldn't necessarily write everything that was in the building on this little map. Like right here, this next door to the millinery shop, this would be Gartner's, and it says DG and furniture. That would be dry goods and furniture, and over a little bit further you can see clothing and hardware at Gartner's. But what Sanborn fire maps used to say for millinery shops, instead of writing millinery, they used the shorthand millie. So millie is an indicative of a millinery shop. Now, what is there today? Most of you have probably already jumped ahead and said, aha, I know where he's going with this. At 108 Quincy Street today is Millie's Restaurant. And Millie's Restaurant is named because of all these Sanborn fire maps that had Millie listed as its indication on the building. It's also owned by the Millers, but if you ask the Millers, they will tell you that the Sanborn maps that all said Millie was really the impetus for them picking that as the restaurant's name. So the next time you're in Millie's, take a look on the wall and look at the history of those photos. The photos are on the wall there of the Jennings sisters from 100 years ago when that building was used as their millinery. Now, next up, I'd like to talk about a mother and daughter duo. I'm going to start with the mother, Marie Kemp Steichen. She was born in 1854 in Luxembourg. Marie was the wife of Jean-Pierre, and she was the mother of famous photographer Edward Steichen. Now, the Steichens lived in Luxembourg, and Jean-Pierre, like many families from the old countries, Jean-Pierre came to America to establish the family here, and he matriculated to Chicago. And he was writing back to Marie to let her know how things were going in America. And Marie had not heard from him in a while, and she became nervous about what had happened to Jean-Pierre. So she took it upon herself to pack up her toddler son, Edward, and the two of them took the transatlantic voyage from Luxembourg over to America. Marie found Jean-Pierre in Chicago, and when she found him, he was broken-willed and he was nearly destitute. And on her transatlantic voyage over to America, she had heard others talk about the wonderful opportunities that were available in Michigan's copper country. So she decided upon herself that the family should move to Hancock, and that's where they would make their mark and make their way in the New World. So when they arrived in Hancock, Marie and Jean-Pierre and their son Edward, Jean-Pierre quickly went to work in the local mines, and Marie got a job with a local merchant. Now, Jean-Pierre was not equipped to be surviving in the mines very well. So after a short period of time, Marie arranged for him to have a clerk position in a local store. So one might say that Marie saved Jean-Pierre both in Chicago and in Hancock. She was the stronger of the two, for sure. And we're going to come back a little bit to Marie here momentarily, but I will add that she noticed that there was an increase in family and cultural activities in the mining town. This would have been in the 1880s. And so Marie decided to open a millinery shop. She beat the Jennings Sisters to that idea. She opened her millinery shop at 321 Quincy Street, and the Steichens lived above the millinery shop. Now, while they lived in Hancock, their second and final child was born, Lillian Steichen. Lillian was born in Hancock in 1883, and she accompanied her father, Jean-Pierre, who sold vegetables all around the streets of Hancock that he grew in his home garden on Quincy Street. This is a picture of Lillian and her brother Edward when they lived in Hancock in 1886. Lillian was frequently photographed by her brother. This picture by Edward is called My Little Sister. It was taken in 1895. Lillian was a graduate of the University of Chicago in 1903. Here's a picture of the Steichen siblings together, and this is called, appropriately, Self-Portrait with My Sister. This was about 1900. Now, Lillian married, and she married someone many of you have probably heard of, Carl Sandburg, who became a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner. She was his inspiration, and they lived together as equals. Their agreement was that Lillian would basically take care of all of life's necessities so that Carl could focus on his writing. And he relied on her for virtually everything. The Sandbergs raised champion dairy goats. Their North Carolina farm is a National Park Service National Historic Site. And the goats that Lillian raised, or the offspring of the goats that Lillian raised, are now designated as a historic herd. Now, Carl wrote of her multiple times, but I would like to read one thing that he wrote of her in one of his poems called The Great Hunt. And this is Carl Sandburg writing of his wife, Lillian Steichen Sandburg. I never knew any more beautiful than you. I have hunted you under my thoughts. I have broken down under the wind and into the roses looking for you. I shall never find any greater than you. You can read more and I encourage you to read more about the Sandbergs in two books, A Great and Glorious Romance and Where Love Begins. And both of those titles were written by their youngest daughter, Helga. Now, getting back to Marie again, I'd like to share a story that's from Edward Steichen's biography, and it's in Edward Steichen's words. So this is a story that Edward Steichen has to say. When work in the copper mines of Hancock, Michigan broke my father's health, my mother assumed the responsibilities of breadwinner and opened a millinery shop. In spite of long, tireless hours in her business, she always made time for heart-to-heart conferences with her children. Once, when I was about 10 years old, I came home from school, and as I was entering the door of her millinery shop, I turned back and shouted into the street, "You dirty little kike!" My mother called me over to the counter where she was serving customers and asked me what it was that I had called out. With innocent frankness, I repeated the insulting remark. She requested the customers to excuse her, locked the door of the shop, and took me upstairs to our apartment. There she talked to me quietly and earnestly for a long, long time, explaining that all people were alike regardless of race, creed, or color. She talked about the evils of bigotry and intolerance. This was possibly the most important single moment in my growth towards manhood, and it certainly was on that day that the seed was sown that 66 years later grew into an exhibition called The Family of Man. And if you're not familiar with The Family of Man, it's arguably the most notable photography exhibit ever created. It was conceived as a manifesto for peace and the fundamental equality of mankind. It's estimated that over 10 million people have seen the exhibit, and it is now permanently archived and displayed at Clairvaux Castle in Luxembourg. And there's a corresponding book about the exhibition, The Family of Man, that's readily available for those who are interested. I highly recommend people to check it out. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a proof of a plaque that the city decided to recognize in the sesquicentennial year of 2013. This plaque says the site of the childhood home of Edward and Lillian, and notes that Lillian was married to writer Carl Sandburg, and notes that 321 Quincy Street is where the seed was sown that grew into Steichen's signature exhibition, The Family of Man. This plaque can be seen on the building at 321 Quincy Street. And here it is, and if you're wondering what 321 Quincy Street is, it's Nutini's Supper Club. Now, the building that's there today is not the same building the Steichens had the millinery in. The building that's there today dates to the first decade of the 20th century, and the Steichens lived there predominantly throughout the 1880s and into the early 1890s. But that is the site, that is the same address where the Steichen home was and where the Steichen millinery shop is. And in this photo, taken in 2013, then Mayor Lisa McKenzie is there with the building owner and from Nutini's, Dave Dahl. And while we're on this photo, I'd like to pause for a moment to mention Lisa McKenzie's contributions to the city. Lisa was a business owner, she's a realtor, she was a city council member for nearly 2 decades, she was a 5-term mayor of Hancock, and a community leader in several groups, including Hancock Rotary, the 4-H Club, and the Celtic Quarter. So that, in very brief, is a little introduction to the Steichen ladies, both Marie and her daughter Lillian Steichen Sandberg. Moving along, next up is Wilhelmina, better known as Minnie Petula. Minnie Petula was born in Finland, and she's seen here in the graduating class of Suomi College of 1904. And if you can see the mouse on the screen, I'm gonna put it right above Minnie's head. This is her in the first graduating class from Suomi College. This is before she was married. She was still Minnie Petula. She later became Minnie Petula Mackey. Now, Minnie, after her graduation from SUNY College, she continued her education in Chicago, Duluth, and Helsinki. She returned to Hancock, and of course, here she is. This is around 1920 or maybe in the early 20s, and she became a member of the SUNY College faculty. She was the principal of the preparatory department. She taught shorthand and typewriting. And Minnie Petula Mackey was the interim president of SUNY College from 1922 to 23, while President John Wargelin completed his master's degree in Ann Arbor. To this day, she remains the only female president in SUNY College Finlandia University's history. And after her presidency, she later became the chair of the Grand Lodge of Ladies of Kaliva in the 1940s. And that's just a little brief introduction to Minnie Petula Mackey. I'm going to apologize in advance for this next photo. It's very pixelated. It's the best one I have, but this is Estelle Hanchett-Sieber. She was born in Hancock in 1887. She's a graduate of Columbia University. She's the daughter of Charles D. Hanchett, who organized the Northern Michigan Building and Loan Association, which most of us would know as DNN. And the Hanchetts resided at 204 Front Street in Hancock. Estelle married Rex Sieber Sr. Rex was the supervisor of the Winona Mining Company and was the chair of the Michigan College of Mining and Technology Department. Pardon me, the Michigan College of Mining and Technology Department of Mechanical Engineering. Rex Sieber chaired mechanical engineering for at least a couple of decades, I believe. And the Siebers resided at 108 Center Street in Hancock. Estelle's stepson, Rex Sieber Jr., was an IBM computing pioneer. And Estelle, in addition to being a leader in Hancock, was elected the president of the Michigan Federation of Women's Clubs on March 19, 1943. She was the president of the club that had over 50,000 members. And this was right in the middle, of course, of World War II, 1943. And her theme for the 50,000+ member organization was Win the War and Build for Peace. And Estelle Hanchett-Sieber represented Michigan at several national functions as travel was allowed during that time. And again, I apologize for the poor photo of her. Next up is Verna Haley. She was born in Hancock in 1914. Verna Haley's father was Edward Edela Mackey. And I don't speak Finnish, I apologize, but I'm told that Edela Mackey stands for South Hill, and thus the family changed their name in America from Edela Mackey to Hilly. Now, Verna performed in Detroit radio dramas in her youth. She became a finalist in Paramount Pictures' nationwide talent search. She made her film debut in 1932 in Madam Butterfly, which starred Cary Grant. She was very prominent in the mid-1930s before she quickly left acting. And I'd like to show you a few pictures of movies that she appeared in. Here's Verna Haley in Duck Soup, where she was with the Marx Brothers. Here she's pictured with Harpo Marx. That was in 1933. Also in 1933, Verna was in Man of the Forest with Randolph Scott, which is what you see here. The following year, 1934, she was in a pair of westerns with John Wayne. The first scene here was The Star Packer. And her second cinematic appearance with the Duke, also in 1934, was in The Trail Beyond. So Verna Haley was, I guess, Hancock's claim to Hollywood fame in the 1930s. Moving along, I'd next like to talk about Mary Seton. Now, Mary Seton began downhill racing at Mount Ripley at the age of 4. She grew up at 309 Harris Avenue in Hancock. She was an all-state standout at Hancock Central High School, where she led the team to state championships in both 1973 and in 1974. Mary Seton represented the United States at the 1976 Olympics in Innsbruck, Austria, where she placed 10th in the slalom and 17th in the giant slalom. She competed for the United States on the World Cup circuit through 1979. She entered the University of Vermont that year and won the individual national championship when she finished first in the slalom and third in the giant slalom. She later married, and as Mary Seton Brush, she's a member of the 2007 inaugural class of Hancock Central High School's Athletic Hall of Fame. So Mary Seton is Hancock's female Olympic athlete. Moving on to another Mary, I'd like to talk about Hancock's first female mayor, whom many of you with us tonight probably knew, Mary Tuiscue. Mary is seen here. She's pictured with Catherine Heidemann in the Hancock City Council chambers. Catherine was also a councilwoman, and Catherine Heidemann was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame in the year of 2000. Mary Tuiscue was Hancock's mayor from 1990 to 1995. And the pavilion at Portage Park is named in honor of both Catherine and Mary. Now moving to Portage Park, Mary is pictured here with Ron Howell, a former city manager. And Mary, and Catherine Heidemann as well, was instrumental in establishing Hancock's sister city relationship with Porvoo, Finland. And the Finnish delegation that knew Mary from her time on the council still speak very fondly of her. Now here's a picture. This is Mary. She's seen here with her husband, Dick. Mary served on numerous local boards and commissions. She was a tireless champion for improving the quality of life for everyone in our community. She was a mentor to me, and I can tell you when I first joined the Hancock City Council, one of the things that she impressed upon me, particularly for communities like Hancock, was that council members are not politicians, they're public servants. And I will always remember and thank Mary for stressing that and instilling that in my mindset. This picture, I'm going to make an argument that these might be the two most recognizable people in Hancock in my lifetime. And of course, I'm speaking of Mary Tuiscue with Joey Huffman. Mary was the city's first female mayor, and I was asked once, what about some of the other positions in city government? So I thought maybe we'd take just a moment and talk about the first females in some of the other city government positions. So as already mentioned, Mary Tuiscue was the mayor from 1990 to 1995. The city of Hancock's first female city manager, officially I suppose, was Nancy Lee Carlson in 1981, but Mildred Robertson served at 4 different times in the 1960s as the acting city manager while she was the city clerk. And if you come down to the city clerks, you'll see that Mildred Robertson was the first female city clerk from 1964 to 1970, but prior to her, riseUP served multiple times as the acting city clerk. Coincidentally, riseUP at the time was the city treasurer. She was the city treasurer from 1931 to 1959 and acted as the acting clerk multiple times. But she was not the first female treasurer in the city. That distinction belongs to Ida Hendrickson, who was our city treasurer from 1923 to 1925. Now, I couldn't get through this presentation without sharing this photo with everyone. This photo was taken at the Hancock home of Peter and Ellie Steinbach, 410 Reservation Street. And Faith and Elise and others and I have debated what's actually happening in this photo. It's unclear. It's clearly a happy occasion. There is a Votes for Women pennant visible in the background. The photo was taken around 1920, so it's speculated by some that this is very possibly a suffrage party image. But I couldn't get by talking about women in Hancock without showing this picture of women in Hancock.
And then I'll just maybe interrupt here, John, to point out that their attire is really quite unusual. That's part of the puzzle.
Thank you. Yes. So if anyone in the audience knows the mystery of what this photo is, reach out to any of us, me or Faith or Elise, and give us some direction on what this is, or even what you think it might be.
There's
Again,
also,
it was taken at the Steinbach home in around 1920.
John, there's also a lot of debate, not only about what the occasion was, but what that thing in the middle is. There's good money on it being the Tower of Donuts, but
it does appear to be a Tower of Donuts. I think every time I see this picture, I gain a couple of pounds just looking at all the treats that are out there. But it is one of my favorite pictures of the era of Hancock, and there certainly are a lot of happy faces in the picture, which is one that I think is the reason why I like it so much, in addition to all the sweet treats.
John, in the chat, Jean Ellis asked, have you asked Gertrude Whitting?
I have not.
Thanks for the tip.
That's a good tip, though. Someone will have to follow up on that.
Yeah.
I'm going to move. I have one more image, and it's a little bit of a plug. And I'm going to put in a plug for Hidden Gems and Towering Tales, a Hancock, Michigan anthology. As Faith mentioned in the introduction, this was published by the city in 2013. It's Hancock's official sesquicentennial publication, celebrating the city's 150th anniversary. That is Edward Steichen, the daughter of Marie Steichen, on the cover. And what I wanted to mention to people is that several of the women, not all of the women, but several of the women that I touched on in tonight's presentation are featured inside the book. And the book is available at Hancock City Hall and at most local booksellers. And on that note, my slides are over. I'd like to thank everyone again who joined us on Zoom tonight and put up with me getting tongue-tied in my performance here. I'm just so not used to not having an audience. It's weird not being able to look out and see all of your faces and banter back and forth while this is going on. That's really the fun, is to interact with people, but hopefully there was some fun and some information that everyone enjoyed here. I'm going to turn it over to Faith Morrison, and hopefully she's going to lead us in a question and answer session. And I guess the hopeful part about it is the answers. Certainly there can be questions, but answers are not promised, but they'll be attempted. So well, Faith, it's all you.
Thank you so much, John. I think I can tell you that the chat is full of people saying how much they enjoyed your presentation and how much they're grateful for this. So some people had to leave, and that's fine. I think I'm just going to risk letting people unmute themselves. I'll figure out how to do that in a second. Are there some questions? So Ruth's question is, John, how did you make your selection? Were there many notable women you had to leave out?
Oh, yes. Like I say, there's too many notable women in Hancock history to count. I made my selection like pretty much anyone would. It's a bit personal. I used people that I was familiar with from the Hidden Gems book.
Hang on a second. I've just caused mayhem trying to fix the problem. All right, go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
So I used some people who I knew had been written about in our Hidden Gems book, because the research and writing had already been done, and we had images for those people. And then I picked a few personal favorites of mine. Of course, Mary Tuiscu was a friend of mine. I wanted to include her as the first female mayor. I really wanted to shed some light on the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, because you're talking about a group that served in this community tirelessly for over a century, and then moved on to other communities that needed them. They decided that, you know, Hancock didn't need them anymore, and they could be better served elsewhere. So it was mostly personal, and mostly for some fun stories. I really like the Jennings Sisters I like the story about how Millie's is named Millie's today, touching on that history. So some of them were just because of fun stories like that. But I tried to pick people who were prominent in different areas. So both, you know, Mary Chase Perry Stratton in the arts, and the Steikens, and the Jennings in business, and you know, Mary Seaton in athletics, and Mary Tuisku in government and community leadership. So I was just trying to get a broad scope of all the different ways that women have led Hancock and led the world, from our, you know, people from our community who have led the world.
Great. I would love to unmute people. I tried unmuting everybody. That was the cacophony we had a second ago. That didn't work. And apparently, even though I've removed the prohibition against unmuting, I have to find you, but there are too many people to find. So I'll just do my best here. Laura wrote into the chat, John, about the last picture of the pseudo-suffrage perhaps meeting. I think it was a waxwork presentation where the women would dress up and characters through history, the conductor, the suffragist, the peasant woman, etc.
Oh, that could be. That's it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
We need to get all of these comments to Jeremiah Mason, the archivist at the KNHP, who where this photo thankfully came from. And the photos came from several sources, some from the Michigan Tech Archives, some from the Finlandia Archives, some from local residents. So I thank everyone who provided photos for the presentation tonight.
Yeah.
Did you get Ruth's question? How did you make your selection? Were there notable women you had to leave out? Oh, sorry. Okay.
That's the one I asked, yep. There's lots of very positive comments and thanks. I saw up here comment from Shelby that she was very gratified to see her sister highlighted. Mary Seaton is her sister, so she sends you those thanks. A fantastic presentation, and thank you so much for honoring my mother, Mary Tuisku, from I guess Mary's daughter, but only known to me as AC 12439. So there's that. So I'm looking down at the
question. Do you know much about Beth Hyden Reed's tenure in the Copper Country?
I don't know a lot about Beth Hyden. I actually have a couple of nice images of her when the Mastahito Trail system was opened, because her and her husband, my understanding, were instrumental in developing the Mastahito. So I don't have them as part of this presentation, so I can't just whip them up on the screen right now. I wish I could, but yes, I have a couple of wonderful pictures I think at the trailhead when they first opened the Mastahito in the 1980s. And of course, for those who don't know, Beth Hyden was Olympic speed skater from Wisconsin. I want to say 1980, was she part of 1980 when her brother Eric was also a multi-gold medalist at the Olympics in Lake Placid. And she eventually moved to the Copper Country, and we can thank her in large part for the Mastahito Trail system.
There's a couple questions about wondering if the oldest home in Hancock will ever be open, and if the Pewabic House will ever be open to the public, and also if you know of any, wondering how many homes in the area have Pewabic Tile in them.
Well, I think I can speak to both of those briefly. At least I can direct on one of them, and that would be on the Celtic Quarter, or what was known as the Pewabic House at 222 Hancock Street. I would recommend contacting the Celtic Quarter. I haven't had an update in a couple of years, but probably Lisa McKenzie is the point person still to contact there. And if Lisa doesn't know what the plans are for the building, she would at least know who to direct you to. You know, I don't think there's been a lot of activity at that building recently, but it is, you know, it is the oldest home in Hancock as far as I know. I'm aware of 4 or maybe 5. One of them is questionable. I'm aware of 4 or 5 buildings that survived the 1867, pardon me, the 1869 fire that tore down most of the village of Hancock. So there's at least 4 buildings that predate 1869 that are still standing, and that's one of them. And another one that services as a residence today is Mark Dennis's home. So, and then pardon me, what was the next question, Elise? I forgot already.
Where are there homes that have Pewabic tile in
So there was several installations of Pewabic tile in Houghton, including at the old Houghton School, which is no longer there, the one that was up by the courthouse. There was one known installation in Hancock during Mary Chase Perry Stratton's lifetime, and it was at what I believe is known as was known as the Larson Building. Now, if you're coming down Hancock Street and you're heading towards the bridge, right about where OHM's offices are in the old Lieblein building, in that general vicinity, there's an apartment building on the opposite side of the street, on the north side of Hancock Street, that has some decks overlooking Hancock Street. That would be the Larson Building. There was a Pewabic tile installation in that building overseen by Mary Chase Perry Stratton. What I have been told by someone who owned the building maybe a generation ago was that during a remodel of the building, not knowing exactly what it was, all of the Pewabic tile was removed and not salvaged.
Oh no.
So to the best of my knowledge, there isn't Pewabic tile dating to Mary Chase Perry Stratton in Hancock today.
There's a number of comments about Beth Hyden Reed in the chat, and people offering some information. So we'll hang on to that.
Great.
Maybe the last question can be Nikki's. Who are your favorite local unsung heroines of the labor movement?
Oh boy, you put me on the spot there.
Well, there's Big Annie, right?
I don't, you know, I must say, and I'm going to offend people, I've never been a huge Big Annie fan. I guess my favorite people are the ones that we don't really know, the women who actually worked to get like things. Well, you're talking about the labor movement. I was thinking of the suffrage movement, but I guess I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I don't know a lot about the society that was in Hancock at the time. You know, there was most of the labor movement that we think of in that decade of the 19-teens was, and most of all the activity around the mining was centered in Calumet at the time. Hancock was kind of the secondary location for that, and there were a lot of labor meetings at Hancock and at Houghton. But you don't hear a lot about, again, you don't hear a lot about the females who participated in those, but they certainly did. So that's a good question. Well, that's an opportunity for someone else to do a presentation on the unsung, you know, labor heroes amongst the females of that generation. Because certainly they're out there. The question is, how difficult would it be to mine information on finding out what they did and what their real roles were and at the time? Because you know, whether you go with the mainstream newspapers or whether you go with the labor newspapers, both of them had their own form of bias. So it's unclear how much truthful information you can really dig up on that. But that would be, I'd be interested to know if anyone wants to pick that up. I would certainly come to that talk.
Yeah. Well, I think it's exactly 8 o'clock, so I think that's a moment for us to take advantage of it. I'd just like to bring it all to a close. John, thank you so much from all of us for really a wonderful talk and for a wonderful something for us to archive that we'll have forever, technology permitted. This is going to go up on the website of the Carnegie Museum, and certainly for the next few decades it'll be around and available. So thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Elise Nelson, Director of the Carnegie Museum, the Carnegie Museum Board, for all their support of these presentations and events, and for her help tonight. And I'd just like to thank all the RiseUP participants and the board for all the events that we have been producing. So that's it for tonight. So again, thanks to everyone for coming, and especially to John for having us.
Thanks, everyone.